In the spring of 2023, Summit County paid Silas Blackwood $4.2 million for a right they believed they already possessed. It was a transaction that appeared nowhere on the year's balance sheets under assets or acquisitions, but rather was buried in a contingency fund disbursement labeled simply Litigation Settlement, Parcel 7B-441. The story of why the county paid a farmer millions of dollars for permission to tax his land properly begins not with a lawsuit, but with a signature made in fountain pen 89 years earlier, on a document stored in a hinged tin box that smelled faintly of rust and cured tobacco. Let me tell you about the land, because that is where the story is rooted. The 124 acres of Blackwood Farm were not remarkable. They did not possess the dramatic, rolling grandeur of the Shenandoah Valley to the east, nor the stark, mineral-rich soil of the Western Territories. It was ordinary Piedmont land in central Virginia, a mix of clay and loam, good for pasture, decent for corn if you knew how to work it, and unforgiving if you did not. Silas Blackwood's grandfather, Thomas Blackwood, had purchased the parcel in 1912. He was 47 years old, a man who had spent the first 25 years of his working life sharecropping on another man's property. The purchase cost him $992, which was $8 an acre. He paid for it with 20 years of saved currency, coins and bills kept in a stoneware crock buried beneath the floorboards of his rented cabin. For Thomas, owning land was not an investment. It was the end of a particular kind of servitude. It was the physical manifestation of self-determination. He and his sons, one of whom was Silas's father, John, cleared the land with mules and their own backs. They pulled 3,418 stumps by hand in the first 3 years. They built the farmhouse from white oak they felled on the property, and the barn from pine. They learned the land's moods, which hollows held the morning fog longest, where the soil soured and needed lime, how the water ran during a thunderstorm. This was knowledge acquired not through study, but through the accumulation of fatigue, calluses, and observation. John Blackwood, born in 1890, inherited the farm not as a piece of real estate, but as a set of obligations. He was obligated to the soil that fed him, to the father who had bought his freedom with it, and to the children he would one day pass it to. The Blackwood family philosophy was simple and unspoken. The land was not a commodity. You did not sell it. You did not borrow against it. You served as its custodian for your allotted time, and you passed it on in better condition than you received it. This was a worldview entirely alien to the concept of highest and best use, a phrase that would not enter the American lexicon for another 50 years. Their measure of value was continuity. The farm had survived the Great War, the Spanish flu, and the early years of the Great Depression. Its worth was measured in bushels of corn, in pounds of cured ham, in the fact that no Blackwood had ever gone to bed hungry. Silas Blackwood was born in that farmhouse in 1935, in the middle of the worst economic collapse the country had ever known. He was 88 years old in 2023. He had been farming this specific 124-acre plot for 74 of those years, since he was old enough to drive a tractor. He was a man of few words, known in the community for his posture. He stood with a slight forward lean, as if perpetually walking into a strong wind. His physical description was unremarkable, save for his hands, which were gnarled and thick, the knuckles swollen like old walnuts. They were the hands of a man who had fixed his own machinery, pulled his own carbs, and gripped the handle of a post-hole digger for 7 decades. His knowledge of the land was not academic. It was cellular. He could tell you the rain was coming an hour before the sky darkened by the way the air felt on his skin and the smell of the damp earth rising from the bottomland field. This intimate, generational knowledge was the first force in our story. The second was its exact opposite. Let me tell you about Summit County, because its transformation is what set the conflict in motion. For most of its history, Summit County was a quiet agricultural region of 12,000 people, a place you passed through on the way to somewhere else. Its budget was modest, its ambitions were few, and its land was valued for what it could produce. But beginning in the 1990s, the sprawl of Washington, D.C., 90 miles to the northeast, began to push outward. First came the commuters, willing to drive 2 hours for cheaper housing. Then came the developers who built that housing. Then came the service industries, the chain restaurants, the big box stores. By 2020, the population of Summit County was 78,000 and climbing. The old farms that once lined Route 29 were now subdivisions with names like Willow Creek Estates and The Ridges at Pine Valley. With population growth came budgetary pressure. The county needed new schools, wider roads, more sheriff's deputies, a larger water treatment facility. The tax base, still heavily reliant on agricultural valuations, was not keeping pace with the demand for services. The county's long-term debt had tripled in a decade, from $50 million to $152 million. The Board of Supervisors saw the solution not in cutting services, but in maximizing revenue. And the largest untapped source of revenue was the land itself. Into this environment stepped Marissa Crane. She was 34 years old, the newly hired Summit County tax assessor. Crane was not from the area. She held a Master of Public Administration from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and had spent the previous 5 years as a deputy assessor in a rapidly growing suburb of Charlotte. She was sharp, confident, and a true believer in the power of data. To her, a parcel of land was a collection of data points: acreage, road frontage, soil type, proximity to utilities, and most importantly, its potential market value. She spoke of rationalizing the tax rolls and ensuring equitable assessment based on market realities. She was the confident outsider, and she was not malicious. She was simply doing her job as she understood it, and her job was to assess property at its fair market value, which the state code defined as what a willing buyer would pay a willing seller. Her first major project was a county-wide reassessment, the first in 15 years. Using Geographic Information System, GIS, mapping, recent sales data, and predictive algorithms, her office was going to bring the county's property valuations into the 21st century. She saw the vast tracts of farmland, still assessed at a few $1,000s per acre, as a gross distortion of the market. A new development, the estates at Summit Ridge, had just sold 200 one-acre lots for an average of $120,000 each, and it bordered the western edge of the Blackwood farm. To Marissa Crane, the 124 acres of Silas Blackwood's property were not a farm. They were 124 potential lots. They were a $15 million asset that was being taxed as if it were worth $500,000. Her job was to correct that discrepancy. The collision of these two worldviews, the farm as a generational trust and the farm as an underperforming asset, arrived in Silas Blackwood's mailbox on a Tuesday in October of 2022. It came in a standard number 10 envelope with the Summit County seal in the top left corner. The notice was printed on pale blue paper, a single sheet folded in thirds. It was a document devoid of emotion. A simple recitation of numbers in columns. Parcel ID 7B-441. Owner Blackwood Silas J. Acreage 124.2. Previous assessed value $485,000. New assessed value $14,904,000. Silas read the numbers twice. He felt no anger, no panic. He felt a deep, cold weariness, the same feeling he got when a piece of machinery broke down in the middle of a harvest. It was a problem to be solved. He walked from the kitchen to the small office where his father had kept his records. On the bottom shelf of a steel filing cabinet was a grey hinged tin box, 12 inches long, 8 inches wide and 4 inches deep. It had once held cigars. Silas's father had bought it in 1928. Silas lifted the lid. Inside were birth certificates, old deeds, his honourable discharge from the army in 1956, and a sheaf of papers tied with a faded red ribbon. He untied the ribbon and carefully unfolded a document. It was heavier than modern paper, with a high linen content, and it was yellowed at the creases. The text was typewritten, but the signatures at the bottom were in a dark, florid script of fountain pen ink. The date at the top read August 14th, 1934. His grandson David arrived that evening for dinner. David was 28 years old, the only child of Silas's late son. He lived in a small apartment in town and worked as a manager at an auto parts store. He loved his grandfather, but he viewed the farm with a mixture of affection and exasperation. It was a place of happy childhood memories, but it was also a relentless consumer of time and money, a relic in a world that had moved on. He saw the reassessment notice on the kitchen table. "Grandad, this is insane," David said, his voice tight with anxiety. $225,000 a year in taxes. We can't pay that. Nobody can pay that. "I know," Silas said quietly. "We have to sell," David continued, pacing the linoleum floor. "We can fight it, appeal it, maybe get it knocked down a bit, but they're not going to knock it down 98%. We sell off 20 acres on the west side, buy that new development. We could clear over $2 million, put the rest in a trust, and you could finally retire. You wouldn't have to worry about money again." It was a logical, modern solution. It was the sensible thing to do. And it was a complete violation of the unspoken Blackwood Code. Silas did not raise his voice. He simply looked at his grandson and said, "Your great-grandfather didn't pull 3,000 stumps so I could sell his labour to a man who built houses with vinyl siding. Get the tin box from the office." Let me tell you about that document from 1934. It was titled Covenant of Easement. It was part of a federal program under the Soil Conservation and Domestic Allotment Act. In the midst of the Dust Bowl, with topsoil blowing away from Texas to the Dakotas, the Roosevelt administration was desperately trying to prevent an ecological catastrophe. One of its lesser-known programs involved paying farmers in other regions to take erosion-prone land out of crop production and convert it to pasture or forest. It was a one-time payment to encourage long-term thinking. John Blackwood had signed such an agreement. A portion of his farm, about 40 acres on a steep grade, was washing out. The federal government, through the Department of Agriculture, paid him $10 per acre for all 124 acres of his property, a total of $1,240. It was a significant sum of money in 1934, the equivalent of a year's profit from the farm. In exchange for that payment, John Blackwood granted the federal government a permanent easement. The agreement restricted the use of the entire 124-acre parcel to agricultural, forestry, or conservational purposes. The key legal phrases, drafted by government lawyers nearly a century ago, were what mattered. The document stated that the restriction was an easement in gross, the burden of which shall run with the land in perpetuity. It was binding not only on John Blackwood, but on his heirs and assigns, and critically, it was binding on any successor in interest to the United States of America, including any state, county, or municipal governing body. Silas had known about the document his whole life. His father had told him about it once, on a cold November day in 1960. "They paid me to keep it a farm," John had said. "A promise is a promise. Don't you forget it." Silas had not forgotten. The meeting at the Summit County Government Centre took place 2 weeks later. The building was a modern structure of glass and steel Opened in 2015, it was climate controlled to a steady 70 degrees and smelled of industrial cleaning solution. It could not have been more different from the Blackwood farmhouse, which smelled of wood smoke, old books, and coffee. Silas wore his Sunday church clothes, grey trousers, a pressed blue shirt, and a worn tweed jacket. David wore a polo shirt and khakis. They were shown into Marissa Crane's office. It was neat and orderly, with a large monitor displaying a satellite map of the county. She was professional and polite, gesturing for them to sit at a small conference table. She had their file open. "Mr. Blackwood," she began, her tone even and reasonable, "I understand you have concerns about the new assessment. Let me walk you through our methodology." For the next 10 minutes, she presented her case with a calm, data-driven certainty. She showed them sales comparison charts, zoning maps, and aerial photographs of the new subdivision next door. She pointed to the red line that marked his property. "The market has determined that the highest and best use of land in this corridor is residential development," she explained. "Our assessment simply reflects that reality. We are legally obligated to assess at 100% of fair market value." David tried to argue. He talked about the farm's low income, about the family history, about the agricultural tax breaks they'd always received. Marissa Crane listened patiently, nodding. "I understand," she said, "and you can certainly continue to apply for land use taxation, which will defer a portion of the taxes as long as you continue to farm. But the underlying assessment must be based on market value. That is the law. My hands are tied." It was the classic defense of the bureaucrat. She was not making the decision, she was merely executing the rules. Silas had been silent for the entire presentation, his gnarled hands resting on the polished table. He waited for both his grandson and the assessor to finish speaking. The silence stretched for a few seconds, then he spoke, his voice raspy but clear. He said, "I have a question for you, ma'am. Are you familiar with federal conservation easements issued under the New Deal?" Marissa Crane blinked. It was not the question she was expecting. "I can't say that I am," she replied. "That would be a historical matter for the federal government. It has no bearing on a local property tax assessment." "I believe it does," Silas said. He slid a carefully made photocopy of the 1934 document across the table. "This is a covenant that runs with the land, in perpetuity. It says the land can only be used for farming." Crane picked up the copy. She read the first page, her brow furrowed. She was a creature of the present, of spreadsheets and databases. A 90-year-old document was an anomaly, an irrelevant piece of paper from a world that no longer existed. Her training had not prepared her for this. She placed the paper back on the table. "Mr. Blackwood, with all due respect, this is a historical curiosity. It's an old agreement with the federal government. It doesn't change the fact that a developer would pay nearly $15 million for your property tomorrow. That is its value. Our assessment stands." The confident outsider had made her critical mistake. She had dismissed the quiet expert's knowledge because it was old and didn't fit her model. She saw a historical artifact. Silas saw a binding promise. "We'll be filing an appeal," Silas said, standing up. The appeal process was slow and methodical. The county's legal department, a team of 3 overworked attorneys, viewed the case as a nuisance. They saw Silas as a stubborn old farmer trying to dodge his taxes. They sent a letter offering to reduce the assessment by 10% as a gesture of goodwill. Silas, through a local lawyer he had hired, a man named Arthur Finch, who was 72 years old and had practiced law in Summit County for 45 years, declined the offer without comment. The county lawyer sighed and scheduled a hearing before the Board of Zoning Appeals, confident they would win easily. They prepared a 50-page binder filled with market data. Arthur Finch prepared a 1-page summary of a 1987 Supreme Court case, Nolan versus California Coastal Commission, which affirmed that land use restrictions could constitute a taking of property rights. The decisive moment came not in a dramatic courtroom, but in the sterile, beige meeting room of the Summit County Board of Supervisors on a Wednesday morning in March 2023. The room was populated by the 5 board members, all local business owners, sitting on a raised dais. Marissa Crane was there with the county attorney. Silas, David, and Arthur Finch sat at a table facing them. The audience of about 30 people consisted mostly of other farmers who had also seen their assessments skyrocket and were watching the Blackwood case as a bellwether. They were the community witnesses. The county attorney, a man named Robert Gill, presented first. He was efficient and professional. He walked the board through Marissa Crane's data, showing the charts and the maps. His argument was simple. The assessment was a correct and accurate reflection of the property's fair market value, as required by state law. The county was legally and morally in the right. It was a 20-minute presentation, and it was entirely convincing. Then Arthur Finch walked to the lectern. He was a small, stooped man who looked more like a librarian than a lawyer. He did not bring a binder. He brought a single yellowed document in a protective plastic sleeve. He didn't make a speech. He didn't argue about fairness or tradition. He simply placed the 1934 easement on the overhead projector, a piece of technology almost as old as he was. The image of the document filled the screen behind the board members. The faded typewriting, the ornate seal of the Department of Agriculture, the sweeping signature of John Blackwood. "Members of the board," Arthur Finch began, his voice soft but carrying in the quiet room. "The county's assessment is based on a single premise, that the highest and best use of this land is development. This assessment of $14.9 million is the value of the land if it could be subdivided and sold for houses. But it cannot." He pointed to a paragraph in the middle of the document projected on the screen. He read it aloud, slowly and deliberately. "This covenant shall run with the land in perpetuity, and be binding upon the grantor's heirs and assigns, and upon all successors in interest to the United States of America, including any state, county, or municipal governing body." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "Summit County," he continued, "is a municipal governing body. This document, recorded in the county land records in 1934, is a cloud on the title. It is a legally binding restriction on the use of the property. The property cannot be legally developed. Therefore, its market value as development land is zero. Its highest and best legal use is the use to which it is currently being put, agriculture. The county's assessment is based on a potential that does not legally exist. It is, therefore, void." A profound silence settled over the room. The board members stared at the document on the screen. They were not lawyers, but they understood the simple, brutal logic of what they had just heard. They turned and looked at their own attorney, Robert Gill. His face was pale. Marissa Crane sat frozen, her binder of data now utterly irrelevant. The chairman of the board, a man who ran a hardware store, leaned into his microphone. "Mr. Gill," he asked, his voice strained, "is this document valid?" Robert Gill took a long breath. He looked at the document, then at Arthur Finch, then back at the board. As an officer of the court, he could not lie. "On its face," he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth, "it appears to be a valid and legally recorded encumbrance." The chairman did not need to hear any more. He called for a motion. A board member moved to grant the appeal and revert the assessment on Parcel 7B-441 to its previous agricultural value. It was seconded. The vote was 5-0 in favour. Silas Blackwood nodded once, slowly. He had won. But the story was not over. In fact, the most ironic chapter was just beginning. Let me tell you about the law of unintended consequences. In trying to extract more revenue from Silas Blackwood, Summit County had stumbled into a much bigger problem. The existence of this forgotten federal easement meant that their comprehensive land use plan, which zoned huge swathes of agricultural land for future development, was built on a foundation of sand. How many other farms had similar unremembered easements sleeping in old tin boxes?
The county's entire strategy for managing growth and funding its future was now in jeopardy. They couldn't risk building a new school or a sewer line based on projected tax revenues from land that might, it turned out, be legally undevelopable. They had to extinguish the Blackwood easement. It was the only way to restore certainty to their own plans, and the only way to do that was to buy it. The county's lawyers approached Arthur Finch a month later. Their opening offer was $500,000 to release the easement.
Silas, with a newfound confidence in the full support of his grandson David, who was now in awe of his grandfather's quiet wisdom, instructed his lawyer to refuse. The negotiation lasted for 4 months. Arthur Finch's argument was as simple and elegant as his presentation to the board had been. The value of the easement, he argued, was the value it denied. It was the difference between the land's value as a farm and its value as a subdivision. That difference was, according to the county's own assessment, approximately $14.4 million. That, he proposed, was the purchase price. The county balked. They didn't have that kind of money in their budget, but they were trapped. Silas Blackwood held all the cards. His 1934 piece of paper was more powerful than their GIS mapping, their bond ratings, and their 5-year capital improvement plan combined. They were locked in a battle between a 21st century spreadsheet and a Depression-era promise, and the promise was winning. They eventually reached a settlement. The county would pay Silas Blackwood $4.2 million to extinguish the easement. To fund it, they had to issue a municipal bond, borrowing the money and passing the cost on to the taxpayers for the next 20 years. The irony was devastating. Marissa Crane's data-driven effort to increase county revenue by $221,500 per year had resulted in a one-time expenditure of $4.2 million, a net loss of spectacular proportions. She resigned her position 6 months later, citing personal reasons, and took a job with a municipal consulting firm in Ohio. But Silas Blackwood added one final condition to the deal. He was an old man. He knew the land would one day pass to David and David's children. The world had changed, and the pressure would not go away. So he took $200,000 of the settlement money and used it to place a new easement on 100 of the 124 acres. This one was a modern conservation easement, granted not to the government, but to a private regional land trust. It permanently restricted development on the core of the farm, while allowing the 24 acres fronting the new subdivision to be sold by future generations if needed. He had used the county's money to guarantee that his father's promise would be kept. David now helps his grandfather run the farm. He is learning the moods of the land, the feel of the air before a rain. The original 1934 easement, now legally void but historically priceless, is framed and hangs on the wall of the farmhouse office, next to a photograph of his great-grandfather John, standing in a field of young corn. The farm is financially secure. The continuity is assured. The county paid millions for a lesson in humility. What survives is not always what is strongest or most profitable. Sometimes what survives is what is most stubborn. A promise made in a time of dust and desperation. A signature in fountain pen on a piece of high linen paper can hold more weight than a terabyte of market data. It can cross generations and force a reckoning. The highest and best use of a thing is not always its highest market price. Sometimes its best use is to remain what it has always been, a silent testament to the idea that some obligations are meant to be kept, not because they are profitable, but because a promise was made. The land remains.